In this session, we will explore the relevance of 12 features of systems thinking in tackling complex problems using the strategies of synthesis, stories, and questions in learning, coaching, and leadership. As I speak about some of these features, please make a list of words that you associate with systems thinking. Complexity is a key feature of systems thinking. We look for patterns rather than linearity. We find patterns that repeat themselves through nature. These are called fractals. In systems thinking, we look for relationships between things rather than isolated objects. We may say this is a family, or even a happy family, or a Russian happy family, whereas with a linear thinking point of view, we may see this simply as a set of isolated dolls of different sizes. We interpret relationships through mapping rather than measuring, and we see circular relationships as in nature, for example, the seasons, or when the weather changes from being very rainy to sunny, or from being very windy to being very calm. The circular economy uses a systems thinking approach in advocating that we use and reuse products instead of making products and disposing of products in a linear fashion. Systems thinking tends to work with networks rather than hierarchies. All forms of life, human, animal, plant, and mineral, are seen to be ecologically interconnected in a web of life. Each one of us is connected to everything else through visible and invisible links. We acknowledge multiple perspectives in systems thinking. These perspectives may be rooted in languages, our beliefs, our cultural norms. These lead to subjective interpretations and assumptions about the world we live in. For example, European languages are written horizontally from left to right, whereas Arabic and Farsi are written from right to left, and Chinese and Japanese are written vertically from top to bottom and from right to left. This highlights the importance of taking multiple perspectives into account and recognizing that the world is perceived through distinct paradigms. To a blind person, the experience of touching an elephant is different depending on the angle and the position from which they touch it. In systems thinking, we attempt to synthesize knowledge from different points of view. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If we dissect an elephant into its constituent parts, we would not be able to put it together again to construct the whole. As Peter Senge says in one of his books, The Fifth Discipline, he says, if we divide an elephant into two, we do not get two elephants, we get a mess. Therefore, systems thinking tends to look at the whole picture before breaking it down into its parts rather than the other way around. The motion that is created when a series of pictures are shown in rapid sequence is called an emergent feature. Emergence is where parts of a lower complexity form a relationship which results in the emergence of a feature that is of higher complexity. When a series of pictures are shown in rapid sequence, it creates an emergent feature of motion. The motion doesn't exist in the isolated parts. The motion in animation films, the emergent feature, appears only, well, it doesn't appear in the isolated parts. It appears only when the isolated parts are connected in rapid sequence. Feedback loops are essential in systems thinking. Our behavior is controlled by internal and external stimuli. As glaciers are melting, there are feedback loops which are changing the behavior of life forms in an attempt to adapt and thrive. What occurs below the surface has an impact on what is taking place above the surface and vice versa. The context is highly important in systems thinking. We learn from quantum theory that even electrons can appear to behave as waves or particles depending on the context. In systems thinking, we look at the global rather than the local. All types of life form are part of systems. We are part of systems within systems made up of all kinds of life form. Every species has a way of organizing itself in a system, including the human species. We have a way of organizing and self-organizing ourselves. Nothing stays the same. Everything is temporal. Systems thinking focuses on dynamic relationships rather than static and fixed events. The butterfly effect is a metaphor that is based on the work of Edward Lorenz. He was a meteorologist who noticed that tiny changes in data resulted in huge changes in weather predictions, leading to the theory that the flap of a butterfly's wings in one location could cause a tornado thousands of miles away or a thunderstorm thousands of miles away. The current coronavirus pandemic is an example of the butterfly effect. A tiny virus in one location has caused huge upheaval in a nonlinear, highly complex way all around the world. The pandemic, combined with social media and multiple other variables, has illustrated how interdependent and interconnected we all are. Another recent example of the butterfly effect is the tsunami in Tonga, which caused a spillage of thousands of barrels of oil in Peru. In this session, we will explore the relevance of systems thinking to learning using the strategy of synthesis, leadership, using stories, and coaching using questions. Let's begin with learning through synthesis. Synthesis is about putting different parts of the jigsaw together in a meaningful way based on the context in which we are learning. A synthesis is not simply a summary. We add our own values, our experiences, and our perceptions in making interpretations. The context is of utmost importance in systems thinking, and for many of us, the way we have been learning during the pandemic is different to the way we learned previously. The fourth industrial revolution has facilitated this. Our education system was designed to support the previous industrial revolutions in an attempt to increase efficiencies in mass production, large-scale distribution, and an exponential increase in our gross domestic product, the GDP. A perpetual increase in a nation's GDP meant power, wealth, and influence in the world. In contrast, the fourth industrial revolution seems to be changing the criteria for success. Fusion of modern technologies has blurred the lines between physical and digital spaces, so the power dynamics between nations are changing fast. Technology has enabled education to be available to the masses, so we can learn what we want, when we want, and where we want. And this means there may be a decreasing reliance on traditional classroom-based learning. Whereas the focus of the previous industrial revolutions was on training people to produce efficiently for a future that was relatively predictable, extracting resources, mass production, mass disposal of waste, now the focus is on generating intelligent ideas for a future that is relatively unpredictable, uncertain, and above all, we have to make sure it's sustainable. The focus is shifting, therefore, from linear production lines to a circular economy where every used product serves to feed into production of something new instead of being buried in a landfill. Contemporary teachers do not know what knowledge their students will need in a future that will be very different to the one they have experienced themselves. Traditionally, in classroom-based learning, the teacher was the source of knowledge and they served as transmitters of this knowledge. Using the metaphor of an empty vessel, the teacher's role used to be to fill the vessel with as much knowledge as it could contain. This kind of education worked to bring us to where we are now in terms of material success and modernization. Using the linear depository model of teaching, teachers were able to train their students how to solve increasingly complex problems. For example, how to mark time using a clock, how to work on a conveyor belt most efficiently, how to use a robot, how to build a rocket. This type of thinking is very conducive to complicated problems, for example, those related to conveyor belts or rockets, but it's not the type of thinking that we need to solve complex problems. What do we mean by complex problems? Snowden in 1999 categorized 4 types of problems: complex, complicated, chaotic, and those he called obvious or simple problems. During the pandemic, examples of complex problems are racial inequalities in health, housing, and education. Examples of complicated problems may be those of unemployment and furlough. Complicated problems are different to complex problems because we can find solutions for complicated ones, and they have relatively temporary solutions compared with the complex problems where we need to find long-term solutions. Chaotic problems are those like the coronavirus, the tsunamis, and the forest fires. These kinds of problems require rapid local responses. Obvious or simple problems, for example, teaching online during lockdown, do not usually require systems thinking because we can usually solve these problems through logical analysis. Learning strategies such as stories, synthesis, and questions are useful for systems thinking. These strategies are generative, and creative insights emerge that are often unpredicted, unplanned, and unexplained. On the other hand, with linear thinking, we work to extract isolated facts which can be analyzed to find the linear cause and effect relationships. This usually leads to static, fixed solutions. There is, of course, a time and a place for each type of thinking. For example, when we are dealing with complicated problems such as unemployment and we need short-term solutions such as food banks and job creation, analysis and cause and effect relationships may suffice. However, when we are tackling complex problems, for example, long-term climate change, we have to think about consequences rather than solutions. When we implement a short-term solution, it usually shifts the problem away temporarily, and it creates consequential problems elsewhere. To solve complex problems, we need to look at the relationships between isolated parts of the system we're operating in. Complex problems cannot easily be solved through analysis. We need to use synthesis instead of analysis, and we need to look at the relationships between each part. For example, a list of isolated ingredients used to make a cake become transformed in the process, and with the higher level of complexity entailed through the process, it doesn't serve to try and identify each isolated ingredient in the cake. Rather, we need to look at the relationships between the different ingredients that produces the new taste, the new flavor, the new texture. Leadership courses are often structured into modules such as strategy, operations, innovation, finance, etc. And it can seem as though these are isolated subjects, especially because the relevant lecturers may have spent decades specializing in their own subjects, so their focus may be quite narrow. However, leaders are not expected to be a specialist in every subject. Leaders are expected to be able to synthesize information, to join the dots between different bits of information, and to collaborate with colleagues to create a nexus where the interactions between knowledge from different parts of the organization or from different parts of the course curriculum come together and generate new knowledge. This skill in being able to build bridges and to integrate knowledge is one of the differences between superficial learning, where it's relatively easy to memorize bits of information, in contrast to deep learning, where new bits of information need to be integrated with knowledge that has been acquired previously and elsewhere. We can say that learning has taken place where there is a change in our perceptions, our beliefs, and our implicit and explicit behavior. A tiny change in our behavior can have a huge impact through a ripple effect, as for example, the pandemic and the recent tsunami in Tonga have illustrated this perfectly well. As leaders, whenever we learn something at a deep level and we behave differently as a result, we are changing the world. As systems leaders, we need to be able to see the wood and also the trees, to be able to analyze and also to synthesize as appropriate. A leader is not an isolated individual. Leadership is about relationships. Without relationships, there is no leadership. When we are tackling complex problems, we have to acknowledge that we are part of the problem. We are within the system in which the problem is manifesting. We are part of the system. Therefore, instead of asking ourselves, who am I as a leader, we need to be asking, who am I being as a leader in relation to others in my organization? Like the butterfly metaphor, leadership is about a cyclical process of transformation from being to becoming and transforming ourselves and others. Because we are part of the system in which we're trying to tackle these complex problems, our own transformation has an impact on the transformation of those who are linked with us in our ecosystem. One of the skills that outstanding leaders seem to have is the ability to not only synthesize knowledge well, but also to be able to use this synthesis to tell stories and ask thought-provoking questions. Stories align very well with systems thinking because they naturally take into account the context, the complexity, the relationship, and the connections between different events. Stories use language well to allow multiple perspectives to be shared and numerous interpretations to be made. In 2015, member countries of the United Nations met to discuss sustainable goals that are urgent for the world to achieve by 2030. They decided on 17 sustainable goals that should make the world a better place for more people, for more animals and other life forms. No doubt there were many stories that persuaded the United Nations to adopt these goals. One of these goals is about reducing inequalities, racial inequalities, for example. We could look at racial inequalities at a global, national, or local level, and we could apply different types of thinking depending on the context. If we look at racial inequalities at a national level, we can see that in 2019, according to the Office for National Statistics, there was a highly significant ethnicity pay gap of over 22% in London and almost 10% in the West Midlands. To explore this in a business context, we might use a PESTLE analysis and create a contextual explanation using political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental issues into account. In my experience, we hardly ever look at the history and the historical context in which these racial inequalities persist. We need to add history to the mix to understand the complexity of the contemporary situation. During the pandemic, more and more people have started to learn for themselves, and in doing so, they have found knowledge that they were never taught at school. And this is quite relevant to our lives in the present day. Because we can learn what we want, when we want, where we want, each of us has at least some information about our family and social history and why we are here and why we are where we are. However, we don't always have time to connect the dots and to identify patterns in which we are positioned and repositioned in contemporary narratives, discourses, and rhetoric. This means that we do not fully understand our own influence and how we are being influenced. As leaders, we need to be able to connect the dots and identify the patterns that we are part of based on our personal and also our social history, our values, our beliefs, and our relationships. Using these facts from history, which I have identified as being highly relevant to me, select any 3 of these facts that are relevant to you and join the dots to create a story about how the current complex problems of racial inequalities in the workplace may be connected to some of these historical facts. And be conscious of your own positioning within this complexity of facts. Questions have been an excellent teaching and learning strategy throughout history. During the pandemic, there have been numerous questions around controversial statues such as Robert Clive, which stands in Whitehall, London. Using a linear thinking strategy, we may weigh up the pros and cons, the costs and the benefits of these statues. However, this balance sheet approach to tackling a complex problem doesn't work too well in the long term. Instead, using a systems thinking approach, we may begin by formulating open questions. For example, how relevant is the British Empire to contemporary branding and reputation? What are the values we are symbolically advocating? How sustainable is commercial success if it's lacking in ethics? How sustainable is modernization based on exploitation? Which stakeholders will be harmed if the statue remains on display, or who will be harmed if it's taken down? Open questions beginning with what, how, where, when, why, which may lead to emergence of insights, new paradigms and shifts in perception. The type of question we ask elicits the type of response. Systems thinking is more aligned with nature than with matter. So examples of systems thinking questions may be, what is the nature of this issue rather than what is the matter? We may ask, what is the impact on all those involved? Who is involved? What is their identity? On the other hand, mechanistic linear thinking focuses on tangible things, and the question may be, what are the costs and the benefits and what are the solutions? Using a systems thinking approach, it's acknowledged that we're unlikely to find a solution. Instead, we will face consequences of our actions and lack of actions. And we need to anticipate these and see what these consequences may be. To improve your knowledge, skills, and behaviors as leaders, you need to use a combination of synthesis, stories, and emergent questions. Learning through collaboration, creating stories, asking profound questions should stimulate and inspire us to transform and become more effective as system leaders in relation to our families, our organizations, and our communities. One of the key principles in systems thinking is giving and receiving feedback and adapting accordingly. So please let me have your feedback on this webinar about systems thinking for solving complex problems such as the ones that we've mentioned, racial inequalities, the pandemics, the tsunamis, and how can we use synthesis, stories, and questions, remembering that no man is an island. Thank you.